all for coming out today. Welcome to our first day of CACE. We are starting off our morning today with a terrific presentation from Brandi, Locke, and Denise Burgher. To introduce them, I'm going to introduce Aleeah Harris. Aleeah is, hold on, I just had her bio right here. In addition to being one of my terrific students, Aleeah is a senior at UNCG, and she is double majoring in English and biology with a minor in human biology. And she later wishes to earn her PhD in biology with a human biology concentration. After that, she plans on becoming a biomedical scientist to help other scientists and doctors find and generate new methods that will provide answers to how we can cure diseases and illnesses. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Aleeah, who is going to introduce our speakers for today.
Thank you, Mr. Boutelle. Hi, everyone. My name is Aleeah Harris, and people that I will be introducing are Brandi, Locke, and Denise Burgher. Did I say that right? I did. You guys can hear me, right? You guys can hear me? Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. Brandi Locke is an English PhD candidate at the University of Delaware. Her work traces the development of Black feminism and literary traditions among Black women activist writers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Her dissertation examines the national newspaper produced by Black club women called The Woman's Era as a site of aesthetic innovation and theorizing the mantle of race women, leading African Americans promoted for the cause of racial uplift. Locke is a senior team member of the Colored Conventions Project at Penn State's Center for Black Digital Research. She leads efforts to develop digital archives and partnerships with educators and artists across North America. Currently, she co-manages a multi-year project to produce murals and public programming in Philadelphia and Wilmington, Delaware, memorializing the colored conventions and the contributions of women to the movement. Denise Burgher is the senior team leader for the curriculum and community engagement on the Colored Conventions Project and at the Center for Black Digital Research at Penn State. She is finishing her PhD in English at the University of Delaware on Afro-Protestant 19th century women writers and theologians. Her work has been supported by dissertation fellowship at the Library Company of Philadelphia and has appeared in Legacy, the Collective Wisdom Handbook, and in numerous public venues. She co-directs Douglas Day and the Digital Humanities Stent Street Project on Alice Dunbar Nelson. Brandi Locke and Denise Burgher will be introducing us to Where Y'all At, locating Black women in the Colored Conventions movement.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Before we begin, Brandi and I would like to acknowledge that the land we are gathered on virtually has long served as the site of meeting and exchange amongst a number of Indigenous peoples, specifically the Kiowa and the Saura. Additionally, North Carolina has been home to many Indigenous peoples at various points in time, including the tribes of the Bear River, Bay River, Cape Fear, Catawba, Chowanoke, Coree, Coronine, Creek, Croatan, Aino, Hatteras, Kiawe, Machapunga, Moritok, Natchez, Nisiok, Pamlico, Shakori, Sara, Shira, Sissipaha, Sugary, Watery, Wiapimak, Wakan, Yadkin, and Yopip. Today, North Carolina recognizes 8 tribes: Kohari, Lumbee, Meherrin, Okaniki, Saponi, Haliwa Saponi, Wakamasiowan, Saponi, and the Eastern Band of Cherokee. We honor and respect the diverse Indigenous peoples connected to this territory on which we gather. Ashe. Thanks to the organizers of the UNCG CACE conference for the warm invitation and all the planning that goes on behind the scenes to make such an august event possible. At the Colored Conventions Project, we practice deep attribution, which means we name the people whose work makes what we do possible, wherever possible, and we cite all the hands that are involved in the production of this work. So our thanks to the members of the CACE Planning Committee, Dr. David Aarons, Ms. Kalia Carter, Dr. Armando Collins, Dr. Jasmine Graves Esselin, Dr. Noel Morissette, AADS student interns, Malurban Kidinu, Geneva Nicholson, Alicia Richardson, Kyla Saunders, Owusu Takyai, Victoria Walters, Augusto Pena, Dr. Armando Collins, Dr. Rhonda Jones, Ms. Nakia Hoskins. The Department of Anthropology, the School of Music, College of Visual and Performing Arts, College of Arts and Sciences, Dean John Kiss, Provost Fellow Regina McCoy, Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor Debbie Storrs, Ms. Kalia Carter, and Ms. Sarah Richardson. And a special shout out to RJ Boutelle for continuing to be an incredible collaborator over these many years, especially to the CCP, and to the fabulous Aleeah Harris, who is a present scholar and a future scientist, for doing such an excellent job introducing us. And yes, you pronounced my name correctly. My name, as Aleeah has already let you so ably know, is Denise Burgher, and I'm joined by my co-chair and partner and colleague and friend, Ms. Brandi Locke, in this adventure of us presenting this keynote for this fabulous conference. So we bring you both greetings from the Center for Black Digital Research at Penn State and the Colored Conventions Project. As you already know, we are here to address the question, where y'all at? Locating Black women's in the Colored Conventions movement. Now, we are also therefore responding to that question during the course of this presentation, and we hope by the time we get to the end, you will be able to answer that with us and feel confident about the answer. So in order to begin to even think about the question, we'll need to establish some context. So what is the Colored Conventions Project and what is the Colored Conventions movement? Let's get started.
I'm going to have
just about to introduce
the slide,
Brandi.
please. Sorry
That's
about
right.
that.
Just about to get Brandi situated so that Brandi can go ahead and get started. So Brandi, whenever you're ready.
Awesome. Thank you. RJ, if you wouldn't mind bringing us the next slide. Just wanted to make sure all of our lovely faces at the Center for Black Digital Research and the CCP are presented here today. So this is just but a fraction of us. And we want to make sure that you become familiar with them over time because we have so many more things to come. But let's go ahead and move on to the next slide so we can really get you acquainted with the Colored Conventions movement's broader history. So the movement is a largely unremembered Black intellectual activist movement that began in 1830 and continued till the turn of the century. For those of you who are familiar with both the Colored Conventions Project and our work in the archives of the Colored Conventions movement, please bear with us. But for everyone else, this will be new because this history is largely unremembered, though we are working every day to address these silences and gaps. Unsurprisingly, the deliberate obfuscation of Black history, which had the power to display 70 years of public, unbroken Black intellectual and political activism taking place across the US and Canada, as well as the participation of tens of thousands of people in North America, Canada, and Africa, produced a profound erasure of Black women and their work, as opposed to a very visible Black male leadership. I'm going to advance the next slide to show you some of the folks who you probably know and don't necessarily know them as the organizers and leaders of the Colored Conventions movement, being Frederick Douglass, Henry Highland Garnett, George Downing, William Whipper, among many more. But today we're going to learn the names of some of the Black women of the Colored Conventions movement: Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Mary Ann Shadd Cary, Mary Miles Bibb, and many other Black women whose names we also don't know yet, but whose labor we can see. Next slide. Okay, Denise, go take it away.
Thank you. Called to order by Bishop Richard Allen in 1830 in Philadelphia, the first Colored Conventions meeting took place in Mother Bethel AME. The gatherer discussed the violence which the free Black community in Ohio had been subject to after the announcement of the purported enforcement of Black codes on free African Americans. Bands of white citizens began harassing and abusing free African Americans who lived in Africatown, beating people, shooting them in their homes, harassing them in the streets, and terrorizing them in their own communities. At the first Colored Convention, the topic was Ohio, but the organizers knew that this was a conversation with broader implications because free Blacks were under siege everywhere in the United States. The first colored convention organized and sent a delegation to the Crown Governor of Canada to establish diplomatic relationships with Canada on behalf of African Americans. They requested safe passage for fleeing African Americans and the right to settle into Canada West, which is where more or less where modern Ontario is, and these requests were granted. A delegation returned to Ohio with this information, and hundreds of Black Ohioans left for Canada overnight. This might seem strange to our contemporary ears as a solution to domestic terrorism, but let me explain. African Americans were not considered citizens in 1830. They had no protection under the law. They could not give witness in court or expect or request the protection of the law. Therefore, there was no institutional recourse for free Blacks from violence, either under the color of authority or as a result of white mobs or vigilantism. The first colored convention meeting, therefore, drives home the fact that the colored conventions movement was an intellectual activist movement which had very specific material goals. Their first work to negotiate and secure asylum status for beleaguered African Americans was a resounding success with immediate material consequences. This strategic political work demonstrates clearly the power and importance of the shadow forum and shadow government which the Colored Conventions movement created and sustained for the African American community beginning in 1830 and continuing until the beginning of the 20th century. The Colored Conventions movement made space for, and in so doing secured, a type of freedom for the Black community. Over the subsequent 70-odd years, organizers, delegates, and participants in the hundreds and perhaps thousands of Colored Conventions movement meetings that took place all across the United States and Canada, and we suspect into the Caribbean and perhaps even Africa, met to discuss, to strategize, and respond to the problems that defined their democracy then and shaped the ways that our nations then and now conceptualized and enacted the fundamental limits and privileges of citizenship, nation, and of freedom. Brandi.
Next slide, please. Oh, next slide, perfect. So the fights to access the ballot box, the jury box, fair pay for work, access to public education, freedom from violence under the color of authority, among many issues, were centrally clear to the work of the convention meetings. Colored conventions were attended by hundreds of thousands of Black folks from across the country and the world, and those meetings produced schools, newspapers, petitions to Congress, as well as forums where these ideas were debated, discussed, refined, and deployed in spaces that became proving grounds for citizenship, statesmanship, and community. Talladega College in Alabama and Howard Law School in DC come directly out of the work of the conventions. The Colored Conventions Project, being us, gathers, curates, digitizes, transcribes, uploads, and then makes freely available the minutes, records, and proceedings of the Colored Conventions. In addition, we create exhibits consisting of interactive maps, timelines, pictures, and supporting research, which explore themes, people, sites, events, anything you can imagine connected to the Colored Conventions. We work with teachers, students, community members, artists, and independent researchers to create the exhibits which are hosted on our site and based on our archive. Next slide. If you've not visited our website, please do. You'll be able to read the primary records of the conventions directly there. And you'll also be able to look through exhibits, which students and scholars have created using the archives as inspiration and foundations for their exploration of a multitude of themes. We've also created K12 curriculum based on those exhibits with extensions for AP classes, college and university classes. We encourage teachers and educators to take advantage of the curriculums, which are designed to be incorporated into the courses, as well as using our archive in an easy and fun manner. Denise, and next slide.
Thanks, Brandi. The CCP Archive is what is known as a scattered or disseminated archive. As we continued gathering these pieces of this archive, which had never been collected or centrally coordinated since there was no clearinghouse or system for organizing Colored Conventions meetings, we found minutes and proceedings and still do, usually in 19th century newspapers, in libraries, historical societies, and even in people's homes in their basements. Meetings were independently organized, locally, regionally, and nationally. As we began searching in earnest, we began to understand the scope of the archive. We had thousands of pages and no way to marshal the resources to manage the amount of work needed to scan, digitize, and transcribe all those documents. We needed help. In 2014, we decided to build a crowdsourcing transcription project to ask our teaching partners and others to help us make digitized registers easier to search, share, and read. We started an initiative that came to be called Transcribe Minutes. We made it an ongoing goal to focus on the many historic Black churches that hosted conventions. Between its launch in February 2015 and January 2017, we worked with a community of about 1,300 people to transcribe over 3,500 pages of conventions. We set about expanding this work in 2017, and we've grown significantly over the years as we partnered with a number of different projects, institutions, and organizations. After we ran our first transcribing event in 2017, focused on the colored conventions, we wanted to expand our horizons. In fall of 2018, we struck up a collaboration with the staff at the Smithsonian Transcription Center and planned our second year's program to feature a new effort launched by the very recently opened Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. The museum was making such a strong statement for the centrality of Black history in American history. We drew a lesson from that opening. The task before us was not how to make an argument for the relevance of Black history. In fact, it was quite the opposite. What we needed to do was to find more ways to deal with the tremendous demand for ways to engage with the legacies and lessons of Black history. Brandi?
Next slide, please. So as we began working with the archive, we noticed that the archives of the convention movement had a severe problem, the absence of women. We knew enough to know that this did not mean that women were not present. We started looking for women and finding them, but we realized we would have to approach the work differently, from data curation to research, analysis to presentation. Since we were creating our own Black DH project, we decided to ensure that Black women were centered in our ongoing work. To that end, we created a principle that informs our goals, practices, and partnerships in centering Black women. Next slide, please. Cumulatively and incrementally, our work began to reveal what we suspected all along. Women played important roles in the colored conventions, just as they had within the wider networks and circuits of Black activism in the 19th century. Women worked as writers, professionals, itinerant speakers, fundraisers, and supporters of a number of social justice issues centering Black liberation. From sitting on committees to grassroots organizing, these women were deeply engaged in the movement at every stage and iteration. Despite being masterful space makers within this Black male-led movement, many of the historic records mask and minimize those efforts, requiring us to be more creative and innovative about our curation, interpretations, and exhibitions. Next slide. The digitization of CCP's and CCP's transcription of these scattered archives allow our data curators, Jim Casey and Anna Lacey, to initiate different methods of finding mentions of women's names across our collection. We began to track any mentions that we might understand as women starting in 2015. For some names, our notations and biographies on our website are the only place digitally that recognizes their presence. And this year on Douglas Day, we introduced a new activity called Find the Names. We invited the Douglas Day community to participate in this indexing. We asked people to identify if the names and documents are female identifiable or unclear. And ultimately, we hope this will expand the index. We've seen firsthand that collective attention to this kind of task helps us piece together information which leads to new research projects. That's why the theme of this year's Douglas Day was, where did they go? This theme is a play on words and is echoed in the topic which we are presenting to you today, and we invite more research, both genealogical and archival, to further uncover the stories of the women whose names we now know, but have yet to understand their stories. Next slide, please. The Color Conventions movement was a collective practice of Black space making, of crafting a generative space to simultaneously resist segregation, racial segregation, and create a practice of community congregation. The aim of Black space making over the 7 decades of the movement was to imagine and reimagine, define and redefine liberation and citizenship on and beyond American soil. The iterative processes of Black freedom struggles reflect the interplay between contending forces within and without the convention movement. As a project, we've tasked ourselves with accounting for those complexities. Kimberly Crenshaw's framework of intersectionality is apt here because it offers a lens through which to view and question what the records of the conventions present. That is, to illuminate and trace the lines of power and privilege, or lack thereof, that inform different modes of Black space making. Digital methods and Black feminist analytical frameworks afford us the potential to identify and understand what's at the core of Black space making traditions when we're able to center the women of the movement. Without these methods and frameworks, we may only tell a story of constraint, marginalization, and silence. But when we locate women in the archive and uncover their space-making practices in the conventions, then we can learn how they envisioned liberation for all, beginning with their own freedom and realized by their own masterful words and deeds. Next slide, please. And Denise, take it away.
Thank you, Brandi. Samantha De Vera is a member of the Colored Conventions project team and a trailblazing scholar whose work on Black women in the Colored Conventions movement exemplifies our core argument while explicating some of the mentions in the archive about Black women whose incursions into the archive are both memorable and telling. Beginning her published essay entitled, "We the Ladies Have Been Deprived of a Voice," uncovering Black women's lives through the Colored Conventions archive, De Vera grounds her discussion in a methodology which provides not just a way to think about the presences of Black women in the Colored Conventions movement, but how to do the work to locate and interpret both their presences and absences in the archive. De Vera writes, "Within the Colored Conventions archive are moments where Black women refused to let the myth of a woman ensnare them. This archive consequently indexes the slow erosion of the imperatives of separate spheres. Transgressing their place as supporters of their husbands and other male relatives, Black women emerge in this archive as antebellum feminists who were pushing progressive and, for the time, radical ideas about gender," end quote. De Vera succinctly captures the dominant contending forces of race and gender within and against which Black women moved to will and do their work. De Vera calls this a form of antebellum feminism, although other critics also call this 19th century Black women's feminism, which by definition does not look like or function in quite the ways contemporary audiences might expect. Black women in the Colored Conventions movement made space not just for their own voices, and definitely not for the sake of their own voices being heard, but for the causes they championed, and by so doing modeled, embodied, and created a freedom unrestricted by gender or race for the collective. A freedom that was accessible to all of the members of the Black community and beyond, because if Black women were centered, then every other member of the community was welcomed and affirmed. Structural analysis allows us to recognize what this means. So for example, if a building is accessible to someone who is in a non-motorized wheelchair, then the building will more likely be accessible to people who cannot walk far distances due to whatever reason, whether illness or age or youth. Those that might need an assistive device, such as a walker or a cane, are also able to enter the building, therefore removing barriers to the person who needs the most help. Because that person is facing the greatest number of barriers, you actually create access for all. So therefore, Black women's space making creates freedom. De Vera traces not just the presences of Black women in the archives, but explains that these glimpses, these moments where we see Black women in the Colored Conventions movement archive are actually sites of rich discovery that allow us to not just see Black women, but to track the evolution of Black women as intellectual activists and actors who not just shaped the broader movements in which they were involved, but developed and executed their own agendas. Offering a detailed history of Julia Williams through a critique of Henry Highland Garnet, which is in a Colored Conventions meeting record, she describes how Maria Chapman critiqued Garnet for being too radical. Garnet said that this was clearly the influence of white radicals, where Garnet curtly pointed out and corrected Chapman, explaining that The only influence on his thoughts and words were from his wife, who some of us might better know as Julia Garnett. De Vera spent much time researching and tracking the evolution and development of Julia Williams before she became Garnett, and discovered that she was a well-known activist and education reformer whose history, however, only registers as a referential glimpse in the recorded words of her husband in a colored convention meeting record. Another example would be the 1849 Columbus State Convention. At this convention, a group of women made the statement, "Whereas we the ladies have been invited to attend the convention and have been deprived of a voice, which we the ladies deem wrong and shameful. Therefore, we will attend no more after tonight unless the privilege is granted." Now this threat seems not to just refer to women's absence from the floor, but women's absence from the convention altogether, if we're to take their words seriously. Since they were already prohibited from speaking from the floor by convention custom, the withdrawal could only be referring to their presences elsewhere. So where were women if not speaking as delegates and presenters from the floor? Why did this threat by the ladies in 1849 have any teeth? What did Black women's work in colored conventions look like? Psyche Williams-Forson's work invites us to think about care work as a form of intellectual activism, and this invitation is borne out by our ability to correctly identify the power of the 1849 ladies' threat. Well, what would have happened if women did not provide the care work that made conventions possible? From another perspective, what is care work and why is it so important if we do not talk about it and understand it as a form of intellectual activism? Care work, the attention paid to the preparation of food, the presentation of food, the cleaning, organizing, and planning for the movement, safety, and comfort, including sleeping and cleaning up for large groups of people, that is critical to the existence of the colored conventions movement, literally was generated by their existence and therefore important to their success. That's care work. Were men arranging where the people would sleep? Were they completing the shopping? Were they washing the clothes, organizing the menus? Were they cleaning up afterwards? No, that's care work. And we know that this was then, as now, often considered women's work. We also know that women's work is rendered invisible and often, therefore, not recorded. The men in 1849 capitulated, and the women delegates were allowed to speak. The men clearly did not want the women to withdraw from the convention, as that decision collectively taken would have no doubt brought the entire proceeding to a dramatic and sudden halt. I would suggest, therefore, that such is the actual power of care work then as now. And if we're thinking about it, and we're thinking about the concept, for example, of emotional labor, we should also include the problem solving, the personality management of meetings held over multiple days and nights with lists of speakers. That probably also fell very heavily on women, not to mention childcare and safety. Care work, therefore, being a sphere of emphasis for Black women, means that their labors and names, however, have been erased. Having established that, we're starting to answer where y'all at, right? We're starting to figure out where Black women were in the colored conventions movement, and more importantly, in our archives. Let's now look at a few Black women who pressed their way into the actual archive. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was a popular and well-known poet and public speaker who not only made a living from her literary work, but was the most popular Black poet of the 19th century, long before the more well-known Paul Laurence Dunbar. Dubbed the Bronze Muse, Harper was a sought-out speaker working for the Maine Anti-Slavery Society as a circuit speaker very early in her activist career. As a former professor at the Amy Union Seminary in Ohio and the product of an independent Black school where she trained in the classics, Harper was a keen and vocal advocate for liberation through education. Yet, Harper's minimized presence in the 1873 Delaware Colored Convention only seems to represent the glimpses of one hagiographic woman. But Harper's singular presence actually indicates a collective of Black women activists. For her hearers then and now, and for researchers now and in the future, Harper's poetry functions as both a declaration of Black feminism and, I suggest, cunning archival resistance. By contextualizing the Delaware 1873 Colored Convention, I show Harper's role at the convention and how her poem, Learning to Read, demonstrate her presence and words as functioning as both an enduring sign and a symbol of a collective. And I suggest that Harper demonstrates a kind of literary activist placemaking characteristic of Black women in Black archives like the Colored Conventions movement. In the 1873 Delaware Convention, Harper appears to fulfill some of the expected care work roles of women in colored conventions. There are many examples of women who sang solos and created what are often termed delectable spreads for the gathered to enjoy. More intriguingly, women like Harper and Mary Ann Shadd Cary deliberately left traces of themselves in the archives, which resisted the intersectional pressures of erasure, functioning instead, as I suggest, clues and markers of Black women's social networks, labors, and enduring presences. So let's look at Harper in the Delaware Convention. The minutes tell us that Harper spoke and shared poems from her book, Sketches of Southern Life. But instead of a copy of her speech or a heavily excerpted draft of the text, as was common when men gave speeches at conventions, the official Delaware Convention reads as follows. Mrs. F.E.W. Harper, being present, was invited to address the convention. She spoke in eloquent terms of the efforts of the colored people and hoped they would not cease until equal rights were in fact within the reach of all. By now, we know that there's more going on here. So let's see if we can figure this out. Harper appears to be just supporting and generally celebrating the work of the collective, which we know was represented in the archives by Black men. However, though invisible, surrounding Harper is a well-developed and effective network of Black women, teachers, parents, and education activists. How do I know? Well, I was intrigued by Harper's appearance in the Dover Convention, and conducting my own research, I discovered this network of Black women quietly and efficiently fighting for the right to public education for Black children over several years. These women completely by this time controlled Howard High School in Wilmington, Delaware. Every single teacher at Howard High School was an African-American woman and had completely taken over the Moral Improvement Association Committee that was established dedicated to the improvement of Black education in Delaware. So practicing Carla Peterson's invocation of responsible speculation, it invited me, and I am suggesting us all, to imagine that for this group of organized Black women educational activists, the planned Dover 1873 convention was a publicity masterstroke. They secured Harper as speaker. She did not happen to be there. Harper was invited and came to Delaware on purpose as she was completing her successful book tour for Southern Life. Harper was the educated and eloquent star the women wanted and needed to garner the attention and create public pressure to facilitate the recalcitrant state to fund public education for Black children in Delaware using Black tax dollars. But it is not this network of women we see, nor do we ever hear their names. We only see Harper, and we do not read or see Harper's words. The archive, as I've shared, offers only a brief summary. Harper's singular presence, therefore, represents the collective lives, labor, and words of this network of Black women education activists. In this Black archive, Harper is synecdochal because she appears to speak only as an invited singular author, but she's actually indicating the presence of a large, well-organized group of Black women educational activists in the state of Delaware. The 1873 convention, as it turns out, was the turning point for Black public education in Delaware. By the end of that same year, the state agreed to support Howard High School, the first and only Black high school in the state. Considering that the University of Delaware was named in the Brown versus Board of Education many years later in 1958, and the most recent lawsuit, Access to Education, was recently filed against the state just 3 years ago, it is clear that the work to overcome the challenges of educating African Americans, but actually all students in the state of Delaware, continues. As I said, Black women's space-making work creates freedom for everybody. And when it is not completed, the consequences redound on the entire collective. The minutes of the Delaware 1873 convention close as follows. The convention was entertained by Mrs. F.E.W. Harper in reading her excellent poem entitled Sketches from Southern Life, after which all joined in singing the doxology. Harper most certainly read her poem, Learning to Read. In this poem, the narrator, Aunt Chloe, recounts strategies enslaved men employed to confound whites in their pursuit of literacy. The tone and direction of the poem shift when Aunt Chloe, facing resistance from members of the Black community, teaches herself to read. The poem closes with a resounding statement of 19th century Black feminism as Aunt Chloe declares, "Then I got a little cabin, a place to call my own, and I felt as independent as a queen upon her throne." As was true of many African-American women activists in the 19th century, community work, though not self-promoting, was not self-effacing. In the closing couplet, Harper celebrates literacy, independence, and happiness as a place to call her own for Black poor women through the pursuit and power of education. What am I suggesting? I'm suggesting that if we turn to the archives, to Black archives, like the Colored Conventions movement, with a clear eye on Black women's space-making work, we will discover through figures like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, new analytical frameworks and intellectual organizing work that was a radical form of Black space making. Brandi?
Thanks, Denise. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to introduce you to Mary Ann Chadwick, another Black woman space maker of the convention movement. She also appears a few times in the convention records, but those mere mentions or apparent absences belie her overwhelming influence on the movement and its lions. A convention attendee from youth, we speculate as early as the first conventions because her father attended those. She became the first African-American woman newspaper editor in North America and the first woman to enroll in Howard University's law school. She went on to have a career over 6 decades long as an educator, labor organizer, suffragette, activist, and writer. Now, her practice of space making plays with presence and proximity, skillfully managing her exercises of agency in order to apply influence from within and without to secure the freedoms of her communities as needed. She saw that the key to collective liberation lay not at the center with the movement's leaders, but at the margins and just across the borders, where other contexts offered access to rights and platforms that could be leveraged in the struggle to empower Black women and families in America. The history books tell her life story as one full of public aspersions, controversy, and failures, with a singular success as editor of the provincial Freedman newspaper. But if we trace her space-making practices, we find a foremother of Black education across the Northeast, of independent Black settlements across Canada, and of Black feminist resistance to exploitation and silence by the day's reform movements. Her activism redefined the Colored Conventions movement by centering those that she represented: Black Canadian immigrationists, Black women, and marginalized voices in the press. So here I'm speaking about her space making in a quite literal and geographical sense. Canadian scholars of Black studies, Ronaldo Walcott and Kristen Mariah, remind us that these identities and communities were flexible and mobile, calling into questions the borders and social divisions that tried to define Chad Carey and her allies, even within the convention movement. Writing herself into public debates and working in organizations and fields, sometimes anonymously, was crucial to her Black political organizing. She ended up shaping how various communities were represented, where they moved, what financial support they received, and how they defined and pursued freedom and racial uplift. So by tracing the ways the convention movement weaves in and out of her life, as well as vice versa, we can rectify the histories and places where she has been forgotten. Presence and proximity also appear as elements of her space-making practice when we look at her Janus space approach to the project of Black nationalism while she lived in Canada. We often implicitly frame Black nationalism in the 19th century as an exclusively American phenomenon. And this goes to for the Colored Conventions Project's work up until recently. On one hand, Mary Ann Chadwick and many of her peers saw the future of Black nationalist politics and identities as being grown in Canadian soil, where they could have property rights and self-governance, or at least representation in the government. But emergent scholarship, like very lately emergent, reveals that others, including Shad Carey at times, envisioned Canada as a place from which to orchestrate and execute important political movements and even violent revolution in America from a distance, not necessarily the permanent solution of relocation that we often discuss. Ronaldo Walcott describes Shad Carey as a figure of the in-between, whose presence between nations, intersecting identities and movements, reveals the permeability of borders that make possible her claims to a Black diasporic belonging, unencumbered by the racial and spatial anxieties of nationalist narratives. And in turn, we get to see the Colored Conventions movement as actually a diasporic movement, where immigration was centrally important to its mission. A more theoretical understanding of Shad Carey's space-making can be found when we look at the proceedings of the Colored National Labor Convention in 1869, where her space-making takes the shape, or rather the form, of discursive and political play with proximity and presence. In the document, we see her attempting to shape prevailing thought and discourse about Black labor through the recognizing of Black women and probing the limits of the organization's practices of inclusion. Scholar Pierre Gabriel Foreman describes the procedural and literary operations of the conventions as enacting a space to debate and disseminate emerging Black legal thought and, quote, a collective and also masculinist articulation of Black subjectivity, end quote. Both are animating proposals for reform action and their execution. So delegates met in Washington, D.C. in 1869 to offer their theories about Black labor history and law labor precedents, and to argue for specific initiatives to develop and improve Black apprenticeships, labor unions, banking, land purchases for Black farmers, inclusive hiring, campaigning for policies and politicians that support Black workers. According to the proceedings of the convention, unfortunately, Shad Carey was met with resistance and marginalization when she attempted to comment on these things. And she critiqued the basis of that resistance on the body's failure to meaningfully address the distinct economic and political barriers women faced. The convention perfunctorily acknowledged women's labor inequities, and they announced their shared conceptualization, implicitly, of labor reform that primarily was for the benefit of male workers and entrepreneurs. Shad Carey responded by infusing Black feminist thought into the agenda in ways that could not be refused, could not be obfuscated by the record. So for the first 2 days of the convention, gender received some perfunctory mentions and speeches, really strictly in lip service to an agreed philosophical stance about not excluding or discriminating on the basis of sex. But then the proceedings take a turn when near closing remarks on the second day by Southern politician James Thomas Rapier, who would later become a US congressman for Alabama, is noted as saying, quote, as to women's rights, he hoped it would be confined north of the Ohio River, end quote. Now, Shad Carey's response to his dismissive rejection of Black women's enfranchisement is only noted on the record as, quote, Mrs. Mary Carey of Canada made a few remarks and the convention adjourned, end quote. So again, we find her here, like many other women, silenced by the official record. And actually she had been, in a very similar manner, recorded in the same way when she delivered a bold and eloquent speech on immigration in 1855 at the National Convention in Philadelphia. Unfortunately, no record of that speech exists. But much like Harper, we can look to outside archives, we can look to other writings and evidence of that speech, as well as Shad Carey really resisting that outside speeches be the only way to rectify the record when we look at what she does the next day of the convention. So what she does to unequivocally center Black women in the official agenda is to play with naming. Her committee's report begins with a recognition of her renaming her role and group as, quote, chairman of the Committee on Female Suffrage, not women's labor, but female suffrage, unquote. And their resolution on women's labor's protections and accounting of the status of women workers totally changes the terms on which the convention's discussion of labor pivots. So she utilizes the politics of naming to revise the record and to reject any kind of refusal about the intertwined political and economic rights that women needed to secure, the intertwining that is of voting rights and labor rights. The resolution that she proposed acknowledges that labor organizing among African Americans was in its infancy. However, that in order to take aim at those issues, she would need, the body would need to address dominant gender norms and white labor models that it had attempted to adopt. She's quoted as saying, quote, "Profit by the mistakes heretofore made by our white fellow citizens in omitting women as co-workers in such societies. That colored women be cordially included in the invitation to further and organize cooperative societies," end quote. She's not only rejecting the notion that white labor models and organizing were just a fatal model to pursue, but also that it's not enough to simply include. Women need to be empowered to be leaders as well, equal leaders. And so rather than deploying her previous approaches of calling attention to the successes of other proximate white-led organizations and societies and movements, she actually encouraged a different line of political action. She calls those organizations out in order to inspire Black male organizers of the conventions to break through the barriers of both race and sex, rather than to seek racial inclusion in labor as well as parity by sacrificing women's rights. Next, she changes the terms again by reporting on women's labor in a way that reframed their experiences, positions, and prospects, but also in a way that aligned with existing convention resolutions for men's labor. The main thrust of her work there, though, was to eliminate the vagaries, the lip service that previous delegates had used to stymie women's empowerment under these patriarchal norms operating within the convention resolutions. She calls for women labor organizers to, quote, "bring to the pursuits of freedom the knowledge of husbandry learned when in bondage," end quote. And then goes on to list a number of industries that should be expanded, as well as cooperatives, entrepreneurial ventures and agencies that women should also be seen and framed as contributors and as having skills and expertise that are economically relevant to racial uplift. This is not a story of women who are hampering the race because of their dark past as enslaved women or as political risks, but rather our assets, our contributors are the source of power for the community economically. She creates examples of that by naming the sculptor Ammonia Lewis and the physician Sarah Mapps Douglas as examples of what it looks like when men support women. And she frames their individual successes as a net gain in social and intellectual capital for the race, despite perceived risks from gender norm transgression as women who engaged in public work. So by evoking multiple generations of working women, she changes the very fabric of the convention's focus. And in the end, it renders her peers' calls for organizing hollow and short-sighted because of its lack of women's representation. So 23 years before Anna Julia Cooper writes, quote, "Only the Black woman can say when and where I enter in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood without violence and without suing or special patronage. Then and there the whole race enters with me," end quote. Shad Carey turns and does the same in addressing the institutional underpinnings of women's position as the linchpin for racial uplift within the labor convention. She writes, quote, "The formation thereof of associations could not fail to impress upon the sterner sex, as in men, the importance of removing all barriers to the full recognition of and success of women as an important industrial and moral agent in the great field of human activities and responsibilities," end quote. She completely redefines the terms of the convention's discourse by refusing to compartmentalize labor rights away from the other rights women sought. And according to the records of the convention movement that our project has assembled to date, it appears that this is the last time she participates in the movement. So perhaps there isn't, at least in her opinion, a follow-up in terms of the convention movement that suggests she had the impact she wanted with respect to labor organizing there in DC. But that is not the end for Mary Ann Chadwick. Again, playing with proximity and presence, she turns her attention to interracial suffragist organizations and events to pursue other methods of enfranchising Black women. And 11 years later, she takes it to the next level when she founds her own women's club in DC, an association for enfranchisement as well as cooperative labor development. So as a project, we hope you find more women in the conventions. We hope that you learn more about their space-making practices, and that you enjoyed us telling more stories about their freedom struggles. We hope also that today's presentation, of just a few of those stories in women brings you to our archive, and that you join us in our work. So I'm gonna ask for the next slide and allow Denise to share a very special surprise with you guys.
Awesome, thank you so much, Brandi. We'd like to end with a special gift and announcement to you at the CACE conference, as we're so grateful for this opportunity to share our work, to share our thoughts about Black women in space making and DH, and the evolution of our project and the ways that it has developed over time. And so we'd like to not only tell you, thank you again for bringing us into this conversation, for giving us the opportunity to talk about our space-making foremothers, but we're also delighted and excited to present the next frontier of our team's efforts to bring the colored conventions to the public. We're in a multi-year, multi-project partnership with Mural Arts Philadelphia to produce 3 murals honoring the movement. The first mural design, which you can see here on your screen, as you can see, there's Mary Ann Chadwick. That's her to the right. Well, they both have, well, yeah, she has she's lighter skinned, she's the one to the right. There's a little circle around her. She's right above the tear out. And to the left, higher up, and she has a bonnet on that's a little harder to see, is Francella Watkins Harper. And you can see that on the second mural, you can see the hashtag BLM, hashtag say our name. These are actually what we consider some of the descendants of both Shad and Harper. So they're featured prominently in the next murals as a way of extending the conversations that began in the 19th century and making those connections to this contemporary moment. So alongside them, we're planning public programs, curriculum, of course, and much more. So we hope that you'll keep an eye out for them as soon as they're announced to be publicly screened. We hope to see you in person. There'll be food. Hopefully this will be post whatever dramatic iteration of this COVID process, which we've not been able to kind of predict, and we really hope that this made sense to you. We really enjoyed thinking about and engaging these engaging these ideas in this way, because these are thoughts that we've had, particularly Brandi and I. I'm not going to speak on her behalf, but she'll nod, I hope, around the Black women in the colored conventions movement, particularly their work as space making within this conflicted space, right? In that they're a part of a Black-led movement, autonomous Black movement, and having to fight against these forces, again, which we've already referenced in mentioning intersectionality. So thank you again for the invitation. We hope that this was, I see Kiwi there. We hope that this was interesting and fun, and we would welcome any questions that you might have, whether about the project, about the work, about the arguments that we made, or anything at all. Thank you.
All right, well, I will unmute myself to take any questions that there are at this time. I'll leave the screen share up so that you all can see these hashtags, these Twitter follows, and the Colored Conventions website. Are there any questions for our presenters? there are, you can feel free to drop those in the Q&A or in the chat.
We're also happy to just strike up conversation about what we've presented with you, RJ, or Aleeah, or amongst ourselves, because we know sometimes it takes a little bit of warming up to have a question. So, you know, since we've got another 15 minutes.
Mm-hmm. Sure, I can prompt this a little bit while we're waiting. Oh, actually, somebody is asking, when are the murals in Philadelphia expected to be displayed?
Yes, so this first of 3 murals, we're expecting it to be produced this summer. We're unfortunately dealing with some timeline issues that came from COVID, but we're still looking to do programming. We're still looking to put up the first mural this summer. And then there are 2 more that will come. As we mentioned, they'll feature Mary Ann Chadwick Carey and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. We're timing those to be in accordance with the anniversaries of their births. So ideally 2023, that one's actually going to be in Wilmington, Delaware. And then ideally the Harper one in Philadelphia again in 2025. So we're, you know, going piece by piece. This is a new process for us, and Philadelphia, Mural Arts Philadelphia has been fantastic. So as details emerge and as we are given the green light to share that, we will be updating our website, our social media, everything, so people can be involved and hear what's up and see what's up.
Since we're talking about the murals, I was wondering if you two could speak a little bit more to what the kind of organizing process has been in going about planning this, in terms of connecting with communities, finding artists, sort of conceptualizing and executing this particular and really important public-facing aspect to this work that I think, as you both sort of wonderfully demonstrated in your presentation, is sort of always driven by this this public-facing ethos and kind of engaging with communities. So I was wondering if you all could talk a little bit more about that organizing process and sort of what the impetus behind that was and sort of what it's looked like, especially as it's a new thing for the Colored Conventions Project and for you both specifically.
Yes, so it has been quite the learning curve. I know Denise can attest to that as well, because our bread and butter really has been communities that are in institutions like libraries, universities, classrooms. So, you know, starting with this infamous landscape of murals in Philadelphia just was totally new grounds. And Mural Arts Philadelphia has been a stunning, stunning set of leaders and guiders and supporters in this process as they've partnered with us. So we're really indebted to them in creating this framework that has been adaptable to allow us to bring our principles and values to this project. So thinking about, you know, what it means for us to be a Black DH project that's sharing a Black history in a quite fraught political landscape that looks to its monuments and looks to its public art to either, you know, challenge or to resemble, to reflect those fraught elements. We decided to go about it unapologetically. We decided to go about it with community first. And in doing so, we really feel that both the design as well as the entire process and the next iterations of that process will have the kind of integrity, the kind of clear messaging about the relevance of Black history to every community, to every neighborhood that's literally underneath the very landscape that you walk. We think that's going to be clear, right? So, you know, we've prioritized looking at Black muralists from Philadelphia, our advisory board, our cultural heritage and art leaders that are Black in Philadelphia. And in terms of even citing locations, considering all of the elements in the design, they've all been rooted in the conventions. So literally from imagining where this mural fits in a tour of Black history in Philadelphia, in a tour of convention history in Philadelphia, as the founding space and place of the movement that is not visible when you walk the streets or really anywhere and you pick up a book. All of that has been part of the process. And it's not just been the movement, but also the women, right? So as you can see in the design, Denise has been just a completely fantastic voice in that process to remind us over and over, it's not enough to bring out the faces and the names and the stories of the men who are probably well known in Philadelphia, frankly, like from kindergarten education about Philly history, but the women. And we're really excited to do that in this first mural and forthcoming ones. Let's see if there's anything in the chat. Yes, Philly girls. Yeah, there's just so much. We really imagine this as an opportunity to connect this longer history to what people identify in themselves as well as in their own communities are, Black leaders and organizers, right? So for example, the site of this first mural where we'll have Frances Ann Marianne and say her name and all of these images. It's at a community that is predominantly Black that already has a placard for some of its foremothers who've lived there for so long, and who have advocated for the larger community to have access to resources and proper housing. And we were so deeply moved to see that when we did a press conference on location to announce the mural. We were approached by members of the community saying, this is the placard of my mom, and she would be so proud to see this mural go up because she is the legacy, right? She is the descendant of that work, and she maybe did, maybe didn't know that right on these very streets around what will be this mural and is around her placard is the very history that she inherited, that empowered her to be this figure, and that empowers me as her daughter, et cetera. And it was fantastic. So we're aiming to recreate that over and over again every time folks see the mural, interact with us. We hope to have digital assets that can be used in tandem with visiting the mural. So bring your class when it's up. Bring your students. Put them on the school bus or walk over. And please use what will be our exhibits and our digital tools to deepen that experience.
Any other questions for our presenters?
If it's okay, I'd also like, and maybe Denise would like to chime in here, I'd also like to highlight what I think might be of interest to folks here, because it is an academic conference, that our center has another organization that is really fermenting and starting to create some really important work. In fact, out of their group, some of my own dissertation work and some of the work I presented today on Mary Ann Chad Carey is a result of these early days of the founding of the Black Women's Organizing Archive, which is headed by Dr. Shirley Moody Turner, also at the Center for Black Digital Research at Penn State. So maybe Denise can say a few words about what is sort of happening, or what the value is of that organization, to encourage people to keep an eye out, not just for CCP and its continued work and happenings, but also what will be brand new to everyone when BWOA makes its entrance.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Brandi. Part of what's great about the work that BWA is already doing, I was going to say its purpose to do, but that's not completely accurate, is it's building on the 19th century foundations of the women of the colored conventions movement and taking us into the 20th and the 21st century. And so BWA is conscientiously building a 20th century archive of Black women's activist efforts. So that's where we're going to really get into one of Brandi's wheelhouses, the Black Women's Club movement, and some of the activists that we know, Pierre Ruffin, Nannie Helen Burroughs, actually quite a few of the women who were on my screensaver behind me, and the work that they did, which will become more legible to us in the contemporary moment because it's closer to our time period, literally and figuratively, it's closer to our time period. And that's also exciting for us because it's going to help students, teachers, and scholars make more explicitly connections between the 19th and the 18th century, the 20th and the 21st. So we're going to start to understand that history isn't really history in the way that we think of it as somehow this disconnected moment or series of moments that have no import or impact or relevance on the contemporary moment. Instead, we'll be able to see these through lines, we'll be able to see these congruences, and we'll be able to understand, therefore, change over time, particularly around women and Black women in specific, in very, very incisive and strategic ways. So BWA is, brand new, brand spanking new, like it hasn't even completely left the factory floor yet. But this is part of what they're bringing, part of the work that they're doing that's bringing to these conversations and bringing to our disciplines. And so we are very excited about participating and watching that take place, because I'm very firmly 19th century. I'm not, it stops for me right before it turns. But I do understand, excuse me, that our inability or the difficulties that we have in making these connections over these hundreds of years makes it more difficult for us to even understand where we are and what it means to be where we are today, and how to understand our place, our location, and then quite frankly, our abilities to act. I mean, I think, without pushing too far into the weeds, I think as a group of educators, we understand that one of our biggest challenges is developing the ability to think and act as critical citizens, right? And not critical to criticize, but critically thinking, conscientious people. And I think the more that we learn about the activism of the past and we understand how much activism actually shaped the choices that were made, the decisions that were made, the laws that were passed, the laws that were challenged, that we understand this is an ongoing project that requires everyone's participation in order for it to become just, in order for it to become something that we want, in order for it to reflect our values. It doesn't just happen. It's not handed down to us. We didn't just, the founding fathers really had it all figured out and we don't need to ever revisit that. No, that's not how it happened. But if we don't understand how these histories evolved and the individuals who were participating and shaping them, then we don't get it. And we make assumptions that are wildly incorrect. And the last thing I'll say about this, I remember at a certain point, I think I was in my late 20s, when I looked around, I was like, oh my God, we're the adults. Oh, that means we have to do all the things. We have to plan the birthday parties and just kind of being kind of shocked by that and going, oh, well, it's a similar thing around our democracy. Right? It's a similar thing around our disciplines. We are the ones who get to decide. And that's part of what's exciting for me. And I think as Brandi and I have had some of these conversations, when you study these women, you study Mary Ann Chadwick, you study Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, you realize that at some point they were like, okay, this isn't right. This isn't working. So then what am I going to do? And then they set about that. And so BWOA, we believe will really help us kind of make those connections, and we believe empower us just in our regular daily lives to be deliberate about our choices and about the worlds that we're trying to shape and create.
100%. And I want to add into there, as dissertating women and as part of a conference that's full of scholars, that the synergy between seeing that everyday transformation of understanding what they have done for us politically, the precedents they've set for us as members of communities that, can now take up that fight in a much different way than they had to back then. It's a synergy that I think is reinvigorated when we have moments like these where we come together as, you know, scholars and take a beat to say, what is the very simple, very superficial story that's told? What is the, you know, easiest way to, you know, say that they are or aren't a space maker? And then say, no, I refuse that. Where do we find a way to tell a story that actually reflects and honors the work that they did? And once you start getting into it, you know, we're so grateful for archives and resources and projects like the CCP's larger community making this possible, as well as, you know, up and coming BWOA and, you know, a number of projects that does this. What it allows us to do is to stop and realize just how masterful and sophisticated they were as thinkers, as writers, as political actors. You know, you think you got them, and then they do something that makes you say, wow, no, they're so much more than we imagine. And I need to tell this story. I need to have it said in a conference, written in an exhibit, you know, backed up with image and archive and whatever I can get my hands on, because, you know, we're falling so short in telling those stories. And without, those are the stories that we bring then to the community organizing table and say, this is what we come from, and this is why what we're doing today is important and cannot just be done with a quickness, right? It has to be done with a sense of the long term. These are women who organize for things, for rights and privileges that they knew they would probably not see themselves. And maybe not even their children would see themselves, right? And I think there's a way that, you know, when we call their names into rooms, we encourage ourselves and our communities to do the same, to say it's okay if I don't benefit myself from this moment, from this organizing, or from this work, but somebody will, and that is much more meaningful in a way. So yeah.
Absolutely. And this emphasis on collectivity and continuity as a kind of method, right? And as kind of guiding principles here, I think is just so important, because if we take a narrower view, right, that moment that you were describing, Brandi, where Mary Ann Shadd Cary makes all these appeals at the 1870 convention and then never goes back to a convention because she seems to have been frustrated by the lack of progress. If that's the end of the story, that's a very partial story. But if we see how sort of her principles and the things she was petitioning for are picked up in the club movement just a few decades later, we get a much kind of, you know, bigger, broader view of continuity and collectivity. So I think we'll probably end there on these sort of wonderful calls to actions and these sort of descriptions of these bigger guiding principles that you all so brilliantly laid out for us. I think that's a wonderful place for us to wrap up here. So thank you both so much for your time, for this incredibly important work you're doing, and for you know, taking some time out of your very busy schedules, especially during a very busy month, to share your thoughts with us and share your works with us, and to inspire us here to pick up that mantle and to join you in this incredibly important work. So thank you both so much.
Thank
And
you.
thank you guys for
so
having
much.
us.
Yes.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Same.